Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be presenting. So my topic today is socially conscious screenwriting, a student-centered approach to pedagogy. And since it's my first time speaking to the group, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Alessandra Bautze, and I am assistant professor of screenwriting at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Let's see. Okay. In my research and creative work have centered on three areas: writing the socially conscious drama, embracing writing as a medium for social change, and including diverse characters as a reflection of real life. And I put up these two images because they represent two specific formative creative experiences and influences for me as a screenwriter and screenwriting instructor. Edward Hume's nonfiction work is novelistic in its account of marginalized communities. And this book, No Matter How Loud I Shout, A Year in the Life of Juvenile Court, sparked my interest in child welfare issues and demonstrated to me at a young age that writing could be used as a tool for making hidden worlds visible, for making a difference. I was also strongly influenced by Deborah Granick and Anne Rossellini in films like Winter's Bone. And back in college, I also took advantage of my knowledge of French to enjoy so many French language films, so many of which had this sense of naturalism, like the Dardenne brothers with Le Gamin en Vélo, Laurent Conté with Entre les Murs, and Claire Denis with 35 Room. And I try to channel that naturalism and social realism in my own work. And over the years, I've made a concerted effort to build up a cohesive body of work, and we can see certain common themes. My projects embrace socially conscious realism, highlight adolescent or young adult female protagonists, feature a strong sense of place, and make hidden worlds visible, as well as they focus on accuracy and research, and often take a large-scale social issue and focus on its effects on one individual or one family. And I've taught this topic, socially conscious screenwriting, at all levels and to students of all backgrounds. So for example, I've taught students in high school through Baltimore Youth Film Arts, which is a community program sponsored by Johns Hopkins University, serving youth ages 16 to 29, all Baltimore City residents. I've also taught deaf and hard of hearing young adults through the Deaf Talent Creative Lab, which was hosted at Georgia State University for 2 week-long sessions over 2 separate summers. I've also taught older adults through the GSU 62 program, as well as, of course, our undergraduates and graduate students, because we have not only a BA in film and media at Georgia State, but an MFA in digital filmmaking. And I bring this up to show that the principles of what I'm going to talk about can work with any student population. And often the students have a range of experience in screenwriting, but the majority have only taken one prior short screenwriting class. And the course I'm going to talk about, which is social justice short fiction screenwriting, I resurrected this class essentially at Georgia State University. And the first question is, what do we mean when we say socially conscious screenwriting? And of course, we can think of many definitions, but I would simply define it as screenwriting that has an element of social commentary distilled into a narrative and featuring specific characters who inhabit a distinct social world. And so some of the key principles are grounding the narrative in character, grounding in specificity of place, and this idea that characters don't need to be likable and don't even necessarily have to be relatable, but as Dustin Lance Black says, make them specific and make them uniquely them. And so here's the course description. Social justice short fiction screenwriting. Students will develop short fiction scripts based on a social justice issue. The course will concentrate on researching and synthesizing the info into an impactful social justice themed short script. So how might I start off this course? And I started off by showing a short film by UK-based deaf filmmaker Ted Evans. And the film is called The End. and I have them watch it with no background information. It's a science fiction, you might call it more speculative fiction, and it's about a group of deaf children, and they follow them through this kind of essentially longitudinal study. And as there is in the story, a treatment is proposed. It's just called the treatment for deafness, whatever the treatment is. We don't really know. And we follow the children as their families decide to have them have this treatment. And eventually, at the end, there's only one older man, and here he is as a child. He came from a deaf family. And at the end, he's the only one left, the only British Sign Language user left, far into the future. And so I have them watch this with no background information, and then I have them read these two op-eds from the New York Times. And one of them, Unlocking the World of Sound for Deaf Children, is about the miracle of cochlear implants, which provide a sense of hearing to profoundly deaf children. And the other one is from deaf novelist Sarah Novich, and it's called A Clearer Message on Cochlear Implants. And she argues that portraying the technology as a miracle is damaging or potentially, because it overlooks not only the cultural aspects that children who are raised without sign language may have social and emotional difficulties later on, but also the bioethical implications. And so then I, of course, ask them some questions. How is the genre of science fiction or speculative fiction, in this case, used as a way to explore issues related to deafness, culture, and technology? Who is this film for? Who might be the audience? And does the film take a side? And how does this objectivity or lack thereof affect your perception of the film? And the textbook we use in this class is from Marilyn Becker, the screenwriter activist, writing social issue movies. And she argues that propaganda is a neutral term. She says, propaganda has become somewhat of a negative word. It is perceived as a technique of dogmatic coercion, but in fact, propaganda is simply a neutral technique, as defined by any standard dictionary as, quote, the systematic propagation of a doctrine or cause, or of information reflecting the views and interests of those advocating such a doctrine or cause. Propaganda can and has been used to do good. And then she goes on to say that all art is propaganda, since it puts forth the philosophy and viewpoint of the artist. The degree to which the artist buys into it depends on the artist's skill. She quotes Orwell, who said, quote, propaganda in some form or another lurks in every book. Every work of art has a meaning and a purpose, a political, social, and religious purpose. Our aesthetic judgments are always colored by our prejudices and beliefs. And then she, in her book, she has this social issue list. And I'm going to show you this. And I think you can surmise why I want to go beyond this list. And she lists many, many social issues, but they're still in very broad and potentially vague categories. For example, under criminal justice, she only lists capital punishment, violence, gun control, and police corruption and brutality as subcategories of that topic. And just at the top of my head, I can think of at least, just one within 1 second that we could add, for example, bail reform. And under child abuse, she puts almost nothing and just says can include human trafficking. And then some of these she doesn't even elaborate on at all. For example, mental health issues. There are no subcategories, or women's rights. And so we use this list as in the textbook, but I really want us to go beyond that. And so I have the students do a brainstorming activity. And to demonstrate this brainstorming activity, I do as you can see, a pretty rough back of the envelope demonstration on the board with a subject that I am familiar with. So so the topic I chose from her list was child abuse, but the subtopic I chose is something that I'm familiar with from extensive reading and some of the projects I've done, which is foster care. And so with this, I said, okay, foster care, let's pick a social environment. I said Los Angeles. Why did I pick Los Angeles? I explained to them because it's the largest and arguably the most beleaguered foster care system in the United States. Then I said, okay, I'm going to pick a population. I'm going to pick teens because they're often they rarely get adopted by that age, unfortunately, and they face significant social challenges. For example, when they age out of the system, they might face homelessness, incarceration, pregnancy, or employment issues, or unfortunately, maybe all four. Then there could also be reunification with family, but then they might have to deal with, for example, addiction, poverty, mental health. And then I write out a very, very rough log line. When she learns that she's pregnant, a teenage girl living in a group home in Los Angeles must figure out what to do. And the end of the log line is super vague. And if I redid that, I would definitely be more specific. But essentially, I have them choose a topic, pick a subtopic, choose a setting, and choose a social environment, for example, the group home, a character, think about the societal challenges, and you can see them here, homelessness, incarceration, pregnancy, employment issues, and think about what specific obstacles would be towards the character goal. And why, you might be saying, why do this activity? This activity aims to mitigate the risks of choosing a subject before choosing a character by getting the students to think about specificity of character and of setting and anchoring the premise in those elements. Because there's always a risk of the story becoming melodramatic or didactic when we're thinking about writing about social issues. But exercises like, for example, filling out a character profile later on can help with that. But going back to the specificity of setting and character, I draw from indie and independent and art house films to demonstrate the importance of these elements to the students. And so Michael Z. Newman, in Indie and American Film Culture, he lists characters are emblems as one of 3 indie cinema viewing strategies that he presents, along with form as a game and when in doubt, read as anti-Hollywood. And he writes, one central function of character-centered kinds of storytelling in indie cinema is to orient attention within the critical context of indie culture to topics or themes raised in indie films, and in particular to issues of social experience and identity, which returns us to the significance of realism in the mainstream/alternative cinema dichotomy. Characters in such films are understood to stand as emblems for their social identities. And for example, if we were watching Wendy and Lucy and Leave No Trace as examples of films that address homelessness, I might ask them, in what ways is Wendy and Lucy an emblem for her social identity? In what ways is Will in Leave No Trace? And does being an emblem mean that a character is one-dimensional? I have them kind of look into this theory. Then I also want to get them thinking about not only the physical setting, but the social environment. So Bordwell writes, if the Hollywood protagonist speeds toward the target, the art film protagonist is presented as sliding passively from one situation to another. If the classical protagonist struggles, the drifting protagonist traces out an itinerary which surveys the film's social world. And so I say, what is the social world of the film that we're discussing? Or what is the social world of the film that you're writing? And I'm citing these 2 scholars, but this is not to say that all social justice screenwriting is inherently indie, independent, or art house. There are, of course, many that are Hollywood, what we consider, classical Hollywood. But I would say that I'm just using this as a framework through which to show the students some of these principles. Then here's a sample writing activity. This is one of several low-stakes activities, separate from the scaffolded assignments, such as the outline, rough draft, etc. And I believe that it's particularly important to have such low-stakes activities to relieve the pressure that can often come from writing about social issues. And this is after we watch Leave No Trace, and it's a dialogue exercise. And it says, once Ben Foster was attached to Leave No Trace, Deborah Granick and Anne Rossellini cut out 40% of the original dialogue that was in the original script, instead relying on subtext and things that weren't said. Think about how you might include alternatives to dialogue in your own short screenplay. Review a scene you've written and cut out half the dialogue. Now, of course, this exercise is predicated on the idea that they've already written the script or a scene, but they might not be at that stage yet, because I do divide them into two groups to make sure that we have enough time to workshop everybody. So the alternative is write a scene and make a conscious effort to use subtext in meaningful actions where you might have ordinarily relied on dialogue. And then, of course, I have them do a little bit of a reflection. And thinking about alternatives to dialogue is especially important when students are working on a project where they've done a lot of research, because we have to avoid the impulse to over-explain, to tell everything we've learned about a given topic. And to go a step further, we can adapt this same activity to relate to action description, as you see, to avoid the impulse to describe every minute action of a character to prove that we are knowledgeable or have done so much research on a given topic. And I've fallen into this trap myself with my screenplay about dog sledding and the impact of incarceration on Alaska Native women. I originally wrote interminable descriptions of the minutiae of dog sledding procedures and protocols. Well, if you want that, you can read a textbook or an instruction manual. But we want to ground everything in the specificity of character and setting. Here's a sample scaffolded assignment, and it's a non-traditional research proposal assignment that I've adapted from the humanities and social sciences for the screenwriting course. So it first asks them, what social issue are you going to explore? And of course, there may be several social issues within one screenplay, but this is just asking them for the major one. Then I have them do a little bit of a lit review. Are there any key debates in the issue that are important to know about? What literature, such as journal articles, books, or films, is already seminal in the field? And what would you like to contribute to this body of literature by writing your screenplay? And be specific. Then I have them choose a comp and think about how their film relates to that. Are they going to present a different perspective on the issue or attempt to correct inaccuracies in the present literature? Then I have them think about what problem would you like to explore? What questions would you like to answer? And in terms of methodology, how are you going to go about getting the information? And what questions do you still have about your social issue that you'd like to have answered before you move on to the outlining process? Because they've already written, at this stage, they've already written a bibliography, but I'm having them expand on that bibliography. And of course, we go through the drafting process. They do an outline, a rough draft, we workshop everything. And then they hand in the final. And this is part of the final portfolio. So they, of course, hand in the final. And then they hand in a self-analysis journal entry, which is a reflection activity that I've had students do since I started teaching, getting them to reflect on their successes and challenges. So I ask, as you went through the writing and revision process, what was the most enjoyable aspect for you? What challenges did you face? How did you address them? What major changes did you make to your script between the first and second drafts? Because sometimes what they think they might have made as the most major change may be different from what I'm thinking. And what are they most proud of? I always want them to reflect on the positives. And what are some potential improvement areas? And of course, I'd love to hear about their career goals. And this reflection activity all goes back to meeting the students where they are. And so as an example, at the Deaf Talent Creative Lab, one of the students used the desert of Arizona as a way to underscore the isolation of the deaf student character in a mainstream school setting in her script. And so I want the students to really feel comfortable and reflect on the positives. And I also don't want them to feel a need to educate the audience, especially if it's about their cultural identity. And I also want them to feel an openness to different genres. And that's often something that comes up in the journal entry, because socially conscious
Alessandra,
realism is not the only approach.
could
And
I
we
ask a quick?
also, of course, throughout the course, use screenwriting tools as opposed to rigid guidelines.
Alessandra, could I ask a quick question?
Yes,
How long is the short screenplay that you're talking
8
about?
to 12 pages.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And so the next section here, student interests and student feedback. So I did a very unscientific study where I went back through the students' portfolios and I looked at the issues that they chose and the genres that they chose to write in. So at the undergraduate level, we had 12 students. 3 of them were actually adult learners, 2 from the GSU 62 program and 1 faculty member from another college who was auditing. And they chose, and this is again the primary category, and this is my interpretation. It may be different from what they think. They may, of course, be more specific, but that we had homophobia, war, child abuse, intimate partner violence, environmental protection, the importance of securing your firearms, mental health, immigration, police brutality, systemic racism, food deserts, and I wasn't sure how to categorize this one, but essentially censorship in schools, specifically focusing on the battle over critical race theory that happened in Florida. And then the genres were drama, historical, biopic, and magical realism. And then at the MFA level, which I just taught last semester, we only had 5 students, which was very, very nice and intimate. And they chose to write about climate change, extremism, autism, trauma, cultural superstitions, and then the genres, science fiction, mockumentary, drama, animation, and children's. And actually, if you line them up, for example, somebody who wrote about extremism, they did it as a mockumentary. Somebody who wrote about trauma did it as an animation, for a script for animation, so that's quite interesting. And so what can we learn from this data? Students are interested in a wide range of issues, and they ground them in a variety of genres. So they're really thinking outside the box, which is really, really great for me to see. And so, of course, we have the workshop, but we don't workshop every week. And so on the weeks that we don't workshop, we discuss 2 films a week. And I assign 2 films a week, and I pair them such that they are 2 lenses on a given social issue. And they often took different approaches to addressing a given social issue, either based on when they were made, the perspective of the filmmaker, but I also wanted the students to think of commonalities. For example, in Wendy and Lucy and Leave No Trace, neither protagonist would think of themselves as homeless, and both take place in Oregon. One pairing that proved particularly fruitful when we were talking about 2 lenses on the carceral state is I'm a fugitive from a chain gang and clemency. And I thought this was very interesting because in my experience, sometimes students are less enthusiastic about the older films, but they really had a lot to say about this pairing, which was really excellent to see. Now let's talk about some challenges. There are a myriad of various challenges, including but not limited to, what text should we choose? Should we start with theme or character? How do we approach cultural appropriation and avoiding that? How do we balance research with the drafting process? How do we develop emotional distance from autobiographical or semi-autobiographical material? And what counts as a social issue? So in terms of the choice of text choices, I'll give you a little anecdote here. So one of my students, after we discussed clemency, they stood up and they said, the films you've picked are too conservative. And they didn't really elaborate on what they meant. So it took me a while to unpack what I believe they meant. And at first I thought, okay, one possibility is, maybe many of the films I chose may have felt like an introduction to a given social issue. For example, in Clemency or Philadelphia, even though they are critically acclaimed and or historically significant. But then I went back to Newman. And Newman says, in Indian American film culture, quote, of course, there have been Hollywood films with minorities in leading roles. Mainstream films that pay attention to marginal social identities, such as Philadelphia, 1993, and Hollywood films made by women, gays and lesbians, and people of color. Intuitively, it would seem that something differentiates such films from independent cinema that addresses the same topics. The distinction is to be found in an implicit conception of the individual in relation to his or her social identity. This conception underlies the distinction between audiences' expectations of the Hollywood and off-Hollywood film. If the multicultural off-Hollywood individual is recognized as a statement on cultural difference, specificity, distinctness, her Hollywood counterpart is typically defined by liberal humanism, by the transcending of difference and demonstration that we are all, at our core, the same, by the universal value of autonomous self. This is why the gay Hollywood film promoted as a first, Philadelphia, establishes such strong parallelism between the two main characters, Andrew and Joe, not only by making them high-powered lawyers who dress and behave alike, but also by framing, staging, and editing them in such a way as to make each one seem like the other's double. In doing so, the film asserts their common humanity and makes both Andrew's homosexuality and Joe's blackness seem less significant in understanding each man more fundamentally as an individual. And Newman, so I say, so this is the challenge. And how can we approach this challenge? And Newman says, independent cinema's audience recognizes the distinctness of cultures and subcultures within the American community and insists on communities, plural, rather than community, singular. Rather than finding the poor and downtrodden, the oppressed racial and ethnic minorities, and other cinematically underrepresented groups are just like, quote, the rest of us. The indie audience sees that their difference is recognized and affirmed. So finally, I figured out that this may be what that student was referring to when they said that certain film choices are too conservative. So I try to foster understanding among the students of the social context in which a film like Philadelphia was made, that audiences at the time were likely unfamiliar with HIV/AIDS relative to what we understand now about the illness. And of course, that it's now, with the advent of antiretroviral medications, regarded as a treatable chronic condition rather than a death sentence. Another thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about the choice of texts is to consider that students will view the film differently depending on their familiarity with the topic, unless this could affect the pedagogical approach to the material. For example, for deaf students who are likely very familiar with the debate between bioethics and the cultural theory of deaf gain, as opposed to hearing loss, as delineated here on the left by Dirksen Bauman in his edited volume, Deaf Gain, Raising the Stakes for Human Diversity, which argues that signed languages and deaf people are integral to society, and that eliminating them through, for example, gene therapy would be, a tragedy. And we also see deaf novelist Sarah Novich, who wrote the New York Times op-ed, her novel True Biz, which references The End, which is also the title of Ted Evans' film. She refers to this film, the title, The End, meaning the end of deafness, and thus deaf cultural identity and the use of sign languages. So if deaf students with this, maybe they have this background knowledge, and of course we could survey them, do a little pre-screening survey, watching Screening the End could be an interesting choice when talking about how to structure a narrative with a specific rhetorical objective, especially given Ted Evans' status as a deaf filmmaker. On the other hand, for students who might not be familiar with the topic, and again, of course, we could do a little survey, we might end up talking more about the subject matter, and then questions of narrative and rhetoric might follow. And yet the students seem to find the most interesting films to be ones where they haven't yet formed a clear opinion on the issue. And then when there's no clear-cut answer to a social issue. And I also like to give, and I know this is a privilege because based on how many students you have, you may not have the time, but in the case with we only had 5 students, I had them pick a free choice movie to get to know what kind of issues are important to them. And they chose Paddington, and which is a children's film, but it intersects with issues of relating to refugees and immigration. So going back to our other challenges, should we start with theme or character? And in the episode of Script Notes that he helmed by himself, Craig Mazin argues that theme is something that has to be argued. And this thematic framework that he puts forth takes a topic from the realm of abstraction to the realm of character need. For example, instead of saying that one theme of Finding Nemo is, quote, fatherhood, Mazin argues that one theme is, quote, if you love someone, you have to let them go, referring to Marlin's character transformation from a neurotic, overprotective single father of a child with a disability to an empowered father who gives his only child the freedom to explore the world. Another thing that I sometimes bring up is this documentary, In Her Own Time, based on the fieldwork of Barbara Meyerhoff, an anthropologist, and it's directed by Leanne Littman. And it's an ethnographic documentary. And it's ostensibly about one thing, but is really about another. So there's the subtext here. So Barbara Meyerhoff is doing field work to explore the Hasidic Jewish community in Los Angeles. But here in this scene, she goes to try and wigs in a Hasidic Jewish shop because the women in that community, their hair is considered to be only for their husband. So they have their natural hair and then they put a wig on top of it when they go out in public. And so she tries on wigs and she asks the shopkeeper, do you know why I'm here? Why do you think I'm trying on this wig? And the shopkeeper says, I have an idea of why you might be here. And we know in the documentary that Barbara Meyerhoff is about to lose her hair to cancer treatment. And so this is an example of how the theme can really intersect with character. And so going back to a few additional challenges, we have the question of cultural appropriation. And this warrants a much larger discussion and really is beyond the scope of this presentation. But I always tell the students that they have a responsibility to get it right. So they have to, research if they're writing outside their own experience, and they need to be ready to accept criticism when they get it wrong. But in doing the in-depth research that goes along with this type of project, this leads us to another challenge, which is the challenge of balancing research and the drafting process. And this is a challenge that comes from writing outside of our own experience. I don't want the students to get so caught up in research that they never start the writing process. But luckily, the time-bound nature of our semester means that they're forced to get rolling and get to the drafting process before they might feel, quote, ready to do so. And I emphasize that they don't need to know every single thing about their chosen topic. And Marilyn Becker emphasizes this well in her text. And yet I again emphasize the specificity of character and setting. There's room to continue to research as they draft, in revision, and of course, room to reflect in the self-analysis journal entry. On the flip side, if you write from your own experience and don't rely as heavily on research, there arises another challenge, which is developing the need to develop emotional distance from autobiographical or semi-autobiographical material. And this was discussed a bit in the Q&A of Dr. Koskakin's session and got me thinking about this. And so one way to do this, to address this, is to rely on the character profile activity and have them begin to see the characters in their script as different from them and coming with their own flaws and their own motivations, separate from what really happened. And another question I got at the end of one of the, towards the end of the semester was, a student asked about his project. He says, is this really a social issue? And I was actually very happy to get this question. Is this a social issue? Because that meant that the student was thinking about the primacy of character and focusing on that. And the examination of the social issue follows, which in my opinion is really the best way to do it. Thank you so much.